Would you do what she asked, even without guarantees? Imagine a quick cut, faces tightened with doubt, a candle flickering, eyes following an unseen voice. This is where the test of faith begins, not a theoretical belief, but a calling that demands a concrete response. Today, we'll delve into this living story, accounts of people who, faced with the 7 unrevealed messages of Medjugorje, decided to obey Mary's voice and experienced firsthand the cost and reward of that decision. Have you ever been there? Stay with me until the end. What you discover now may surprise you. When we speak of following Mary's voice, many imagine easy miracles or spectacular signs. The truth we will explore is different. These are decisions that are both small and radical, simple gestures that shatter comfort and reconfigure lives. Some abandoned material security, others chose reconciliation in broken families. Many began an inner pilgrimage that transformed doubts into convictions. These accounts are not just stories meant to move, they are practical evidence, patterns that reappear, signs of a calling that demands discernment, courage, and, above all, fidelity. For those who follow these messages, Medjugorje has left a trail of human experiences where mystery meets the everyday. Some describe a peace that arrives amidst the storm. Others tell of losses that, over time, revealed unexpected spiritual gains. It is precisely in this contrast that the test of faith reveals itself. It is not always gentle, often costly, but almost always produces fruits that do not fit into the immediate imagination. As you listen to these stories, notice the sensory details: the smell of a house that is leaving, the dawn when someone kneels, the look that finds forgiveness. These are the small signs that, together, form a mosaic of transformation. Throughout this introduction, we've already begun to see a pattern. The call appears silently, demands a response, and tests our fidelity. But how can we distinguish a true calling? How can we avoid confusing, fleeting emotion with guidance from above? These questions will emerge naturally in the stories we'll hear, and you'll notice that among the accounts, practical clues for discernment emerge: coherence with the teachings of the gospel, confirmation through prayer, the inner peace that accompanies the decision, and the fruits of love that manifest afterward. It's not an infallible manual, but it is a compass for those who want to walk with prudence. As you connect with these voices, keep in mind that not all heroism is painless. Some stories involve tears, suffering, and moments of abandonment. Others show that mistakes are also part of the journey, and that community, confession, and prayer can put a person back on the right path. This honesty is essential. We're not romanticizing the calling. We're looking at it with open eyes, ready to learn from both victories and failures, and what leads someone to say yes when everything around them says no. Sometimes it's a disturbing dream. Other times, a persistent feeling that something greater is calling for change. For many, the 7 unrevealed messages of Medjugorje have emerged as a thread that, when courageously pulled, has untied old knots, and from there, concrete changes have come: inner healing, family reconciliations, new vocations, acts of service that previously seemed impossible. Now, take a deep breath and prepare yourself. In the next parts, we'll hear real testimonies, delving into the decisive moments, the nights when the choice was made, and the mornings when the consequences began to appear. Each account will offer lessons, doubts, and signs that can help you discern whether a calling is to be accepted, resisted, or reevaluated, and will show, above all, that following Mary's voice is a test that transforms those who undergo it. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what resonated most with you. Tell me about an experience, a question, or simply a feeling that stuck with you. Reading your stories and responses helps me understand what truly matters to those watching and makes this space a living space, not just a monologue. If you've been through something similar, share it. If you've never experienced anything like it, share what strikes you about these narratives. Sometimes a small comment opens a door to great comfort or a conversation that changes paths. And if this content has added something to your spiritual life or sparked curiosity, like the video, it's a simple gesture, but it helps the message reach more people who need to hear stories like these. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. When you subscribe, you signal that you want to continue this journey with us, and I prepare more testimonies, reflections, and practical guidance precisely because of this feedback. This isn't empty propaganda. Every comment, every like, and every new subscription creates a support network that allows these voices, sometimes so fragile, sometimes so firm, to find those who need to hear them. So, if this video touched you, leave a message, hit the like button, and subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Now that we're all listening together, come with me. Let's delve into the first testimony, a tale of renunciation that begins in the early hours of the morning and ends, surprisingly, in peace, and you'll see how that small act of courage changed everything. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding exactly what the 7 unrevealed messages of Medjugorje are and why they provoke such radical decisions helps transform curiosity into discernment and real transformation in the lives of those who receive them. For many people, these messages are not mere theological sentences or loose phrases. They are practical invitations to a change of mindset, instructions that touch daily life, guidance that confronts the individual with concrete choices, more intense prayer, fasting, reconciliation, abandoning habits that stifle faith, and sometimes even physical displacements, such as pilgrimages. Calling them unrevealed is to acknowledge that they are not all publicly explained in detail. There is a mystery, a hidden truth that manifests itself more in its impact than in its complete exposition, and it is precisely this veil that forces one to decide with their heart, not just their head, to understand why these messages create disruption. Imagine this: instead of telling you what to do in an abstract way, they point to a change in the pace of life. Instead of proposing theories about spirituality, they call for action, a discipline of prayer, a fast that cuts out distractions, a gesture of forgiveness that dismantles old grudges. When a message resonates like this, it leaves no room for neutrality. Neutrality ceases to be an option because the message, in practice, creates a tension between who you already are and who you are called to be. It is this tension that leads to the test: follow the voice or remain in the status quo. And that is why the decisions seem radical, not because the message demands spectacle, but because it demands consistency and courage to transform small actions into new habits that change an entire story. Technically, one could say that the 7 messages revolve around repeated axes: inner conversion, constant prayer, fasting and penance, peace and reconciliation, family protection, renewal of personal commitment to God, and attention to the signs. But to reduce the message to 7 titles is to lose what is truly alive within them. What matters is the cumulative effect, a seemingly simple decision turning off your cell phone for a few hours a day to pray, for example, acts as a lever that changes priorities, mindsets, and even relationships. And when this decision finds itself in a community context, when other people also respond, the impact is magnified. Prayer communities, support circles, and stories of healing emerge that no one anticipated. It is this ripple effect that many call the test of faith. Life rearranges itself based on a choice that, at first glance, seemed modest. Emotionally, following these messages requires facing long-held fears: fear of losing security, fear of being ridiculed, fear of being alone. That's why the stories we'll hear don't just speak of external actions, they speak of inner journeys. Transformation isn't just about changing what you do, but about changing who you are. Mindsets shift. What once seemed essential loses weight, and what once seemed small gains centrality. A concrete gesture of obedience may seem like an external renunciation, but it's often an internal gain piece, meaning clarity. And this dynamic is simultaneously contradictory. It hurts and liberates. It demands and rewards. It simplifies and deepens. Understanding this paradox is essential to walking wisely. From a practical standpoint, why do so many people report drastic ruptures? Because the message isn't just an isolated spiritual call. It's an invitation to enter a new way of living, impacting work, family, friendships, and routine. Consider someone who, after an intense prayer experience, realizes incompatibilities between their work and their new awareness. The decision might be to seek a job that respects their prayer schedule or adjust priorities so that their faith isn't marginalized. For others, the impact manifests itself in relationships. Forgiving an offender may be more costly than any material sacrifice, but it is there that the change becomes visible and lasting. These aren't movie scenes, they're behind-the-scenes glimpses of real lives where faith is tested in the small choices that, together, reshape destinies. There is also a component of progressive revelation. Not every call comes with all the instructions at once. Often, the hidden truth is revealed in stages. First a concern, then a dream, then signs that repeat themselves. This process requires patience and, paradoxically, decisiveness as well. It is not uncommon for someone to live weeks or months in tension, seeking confirmation through prayer, fasting, and conversations with spiritual guides. This is the work of discernment, knowing how to listen, test, wait, and, when peace accompanies the decision, move forward. Discernment is not cowardly hesitation. It is considered courage. And knowing this reduces the anxiety of making radical decisions. They cease to be impulses and become calculated steps, supported by spiritual practice and community. Now, if we return to the stories, we will notice recurring patterns: the presence of inner peace after the decision, the constancy of a test that prolongs the process, the emergence of unexpected fruits that validate the choice over time. It's not an exact science, but it is a type of spiritual logic that can be learned. Those who make such decisions often say that there seemed to be no alternative. The message demanded coherence. And this is where courage and humility meet: the courage to obey, the the humility to recognize that change can come with pain and that community is a key part of the healing process. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic and explain how this translates into practical steps for those who feel this calling but need a method. First, silence. The voice is heard best when we eliminate the noise from everyday life. Second, consistency. Daily practice, however brief, solidifies change. Third, confession and accompaniment. Sharing the path with someone you trust brings clarity and prevents overreaction. Fourth, small tests of obedience. Do something simple and see the results before making bigger decisions. This sequence isn't a magic formula, but it's a behind-the-scenes script that many who have experienced these revelations have followed without realizing it, and which, with intention, can guide those seeking prudence and courage at the same time. As you listen to the concrete stories that follow, notice how these steps manifest in practice. The silence that brought a clearer vision, the constancy that generated a change in habits, the confession that reorganized a family, the small tests that paved the way for bigger decisions. These are the keys that transform a mystical message into everyday practices with real impact. And if any of this resonates with you, leave a comment with the phrase, "I'm on this journey too." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. It was dawn when everything began to become clear to her, not with spotlights, but with the soft glow of a candle flickering in the kitchen. The smell of brewed coffee, still warm in the pot, mingled with the scent of the house, damp cloth, ancient wood, the familiar scent that tells stories of generations. At that hour, the world seemed small and close. Everything around breathed the same old familiarity, and it was precisely this comfort that began to hurt. It wasn't a physical pain. It was a restlessness in the soul, an uncomfortable sensation like the sound of a clock that comes to life in the silence and keeps one awake. Her name was Anna. I'll keep her name confidential, out of respect for the intimate tone of the story, and her journey didn't begin with a public act. It began with an internal whisper, a voice that didn't issue strident orders, but suggested a direction. Pray more, forgive someone she'd hurt, let go of a project that consumed her time and peace. Her first reaction was disbelief. Could it just be fatigue, she thought? Could it be a passing desire for change? The mentality she'd lived with until then dictated safety first, faith second, stability above all else. But that hidden truth wasn't content with vague promises. It was a calling that pushed her toward concrete decisions. That night, Anna sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug that wasn't quite warm, staring at the flickering flame as if dancing with doubts. The silence of the house, the sigh of the fan, the distant hum of the street acted as a kind of soundtrack to the backstage of her soul. She remembered small signs she'd been ignoring, a recurring dream, the memory of a prayer that made her cry in secret, the face of someone asking for forgiveness without being able to speak. The impact of these accumulated details reached a point where staying would be more difficult than responding. The decision didn't come in a heroic flash. It came as a sequence of small choices. Getting up, walking to the room where she kept memories, opening a drawer, and taking out a notebook where, months before, she'd recorded promises and fears. The first act of obedience was simple and, at the same time, radical. Instead of sleeping and postponing her anxiety until the next day, she picked up her notebook, turned on the lamp, and began to write. They weren't career plans or shopping lists. They were short words. Forgive Maria. Fast on Fridays. Visit Father. She wrote down what the voice asked, and as she wrote, she felt a strange relief, as if naming the decision already made it real. Then came the next step. She turned off the television that usually filled her evenings and, for the first time in years, spent some time in absolute silence. At first, the silence felt like a void. Her mind raced for distractions, but gradually, a different kind of presence entered, a calm that patiently draws new contours in the mind. The transformation wasn't automatic. In the following weeks, Anna faced both external and internal resistance. Her husband found the change in routine strange. Her boss commented that this church thing was sapping her focus. Friends made lighthearted jokes that stung more than she expected. This external pressure tested her resolve. Internally, fears arose. Had she made a mistake? Would she regret it? The decisions that had seemed clear in the early hours began to feel heavy as daily life demanded attention. And that was when the test came, continuing to obey despite criticism, maintaining small acts of fidelity when no one was watching, choosing consistency with what she felt was true, even if it meant losing immediate comfort. One episode stuck with me. On a Friday, the day of fasting she had decided to follow, Anna received a job offer that meant a raise and more stability, an opportunity that, months earlier, she would have celebrated wholeheartedly. The offer came as a clear temptation: maintain her standard of living, the security that her established life brought. But the message that had been lingering in her soul for months proposed something different. Live with less to gain more in conviction. Prioritize family time and prayer over overtime and social recognition. Choosing at that moment meant giving up something concrete. She agreed to forfeit what many would consider a sure gain: To outsiders, the decision seemed irrational. To her, it was consistent with the new mindset that was forming, a mindset focused on the essential, not the comfortable. The process brought suffering, of course. There were nights of doubt, tears held back on the pillow, difficult conversations with people I loved, but it also brought subtle revelations, an inner peace that didn't come from external circumstances, small reconciliations that previously seemed impossible, the rediscovery of forgotten gifts and affinities. The transformation wasn't spectacular. Like in a movie, it was slow and profound, like the work of a potter who calmly shapes clay, taking what's left, adding meaning. By dividing her days between prayer, work, and small sacrifices, Anna began to notice a practical, impactless anxiety, clearer choices, a greater presence with her children. What seemed like a cost began to bear unexpected fruits. There's something important in this story. The courage to obey was born of continuous practice. It wasn't a burst of faith, but a constancy of choices created in silence. The discipline of a brief prayer every day. The humble gesture of forgiving when pride called for revenge. The testing of short fast Saul of this built a bridge between the initial uneasiness and a life that was beginning to pulse differently. These practices didn't eliminate the difficulties, but they provided tools to navigate them with dignity. The test of faith, in this case, wasn't demonstrated by a grand public miracle, but rather by the small, repeated moments in which the decision was maintained. There was also a moment of recognition. Family members began to notice changes, not necessarily understanding what was happening, but observing a new willingness. An aunt, who had been distant for years because of old conflicts, felt invited to talk, and in the conversation, forgiveness emerged that sealed wounds. A friend who was experiencing depression received practical support and, months later, reported improvement. These fruits served as discrete confirmations, not categorical proof, but as signs that reinforced that the journey was having a real impact and that this impact extended beyond the person who chose to obey. Anna's story highlights something central. Following the voice often requires giving up comfort to gain truth. It requires accepting that small decisions can transform mindsets and, over time, reconfigure entire priorities. This is why so many people describe this path as a test, not because faith needs to be tested by others, but because the choice itself reveals who we are. When convenience ceases to guide our choices, there is pain. Yes, there is renunciation. There are nights when doubt screams, but there are also moments of luminosity, so subtle that only those who experience it can recognize it. An unexpected smile, a healing conversation, a clarity previously denied by the noise of routine. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because understanding the details of this transformation helps you see the concrete steps anyone can take if they feel this calling. And as we delve into the behind the scenes, you'll realize that the journey in each story holds applicable lessons, not ready-made formulas, but path. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. I clearly remember the sound of the door closing in that house. A clack that seemed to echo through hallways filled with unspoken stories. The voice that emerged wasn't a shrill order. It was a subtle invitation, something that stirred the family's most hidden fibers. At the center of this story was Clara, a woman who, after years of silence and hurt, began to hear an inner insistence. Pray, seek your brother, bring peace where there is division. The hidden truth that knocked on her life's door didn't promise instant solutions, but pointed to a transformation that required courageous decisions and a change of mindset. The house, once filled with shy smiles and interrupted conversations, had become a stage for disagreements. Her son had distanced himself after a fight that seemed minor from the outside, but to those who lived there, felt like a deep cut. The proud father had closed himself off in excuses, and the mother lived with a mixture of guilt and exhaustion. The routine, once comforting, now resembled a mechanical routine: quick meals, glances that weren't met, the echo of words that didn't heal. Clara felt the impact of this distance firsthand. Sleepless nights, a feeling that something essential had been lost. The call she received, the one many attribute to Maria's voice, was not to assign blame, but to heal a wound with concrete steps. The first night she decided to act. The atmosphere was tense. The clock ticked in an empty room, and the house seemed to hold its breath. She went to her son's room, carefully opened the door, and smelled adolescence in the air. Perfume, clothes on the floor, forgotten headphones. There was a silence that hurt. Clara stood still, and with a timid attempt, spoke softly, almost in a whisper. Pedro? On the other side of the door, a closed voice answered. What do you want? The answer was curt, cold, but she returned the next day, and the day after, bringing not demands, but small offers: a homemade lunch, an ironed shirt, a sincere question about how he was. Nothing grand, dramatic, just an insistence on signs of care. Small acts that, added together, began to unravel old knots. At the same time, Clara began introducing simple rituals into her home, a brief prayer before meals, a moment of silence together in the evening's gestures that seemed invisible but that gradually changed the texture of their coexistence. The transformation didn't come magically. It came in conversations that began to stretch for minutes longer, in narratives her son began to share without realizing it, in glances that had previously been averted but now held. In one such moment, her father sat at the table and, with a trembling voice, said, "I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner." The sound of that declaration was like water on parched ground, slow, but capable of making things grow. The scene deserved a close-up, her father's hand trembling as he placed the glass, the silence that descended, and the rhythm of their breaths. Small reverberations of a shift in mentality were just beginning. There was resistance. Of course, not everything was immediately embraced. Theories and rational explanations competed with what faith suggested. Friends and relatives commented, "It's just a phase. You'll always find a way," or even it was because of that new religion. But the journey of reconciliation wasn't defined by outside opinions. What cemented the turnaround was the constancy of decisions to keep knocking on the door, to keep speaking with love, to keep praying when no one seemed to be watching. These behind-the-scenes moments of insistence and prayer were the laboratory where change took hold. The idea that small acts have a big impact began to prove itself through subtle signs. Less awkwardness at the table, more involuntary laughter. The television turned off earlier to talk. One night remained etched in Clara's heart. It was late afternoon, the sound of rain beating against the window, and in the background, a soft song someone had played. Pedro entered the kitchen, hesitated, and said without looking her in the eye, "Mom, can I speak?" The sentence came out, with a mixture of fear and relief. She responded with only a nod, and then fell silent, listening. He spoke of resentments, of a pride that prevented him from asking for forgiveness, of hurts he masked as independence. The confession was short, sharp, but liberating. At the end, there was a hug that lasted longer than all the previous years. Of distance, the sound of the hug, the tight, unhurried hug, seemed to carry the strength of a reconciliation long in the making. And there, in the warmth of that gesture, many realized that the word forgiveness is practical, not theoretical. To forgive is to reorganize decisions and priorities, to change the mindset that prioritizes the self over the we. In the following weeks, the effects amplified in ways neither Clara nor her family expected. The impact was practical. Dinners, where they discussed the week and not just problems, the father starting to participate in small family routines, the son accepting help in difficult moments. Sometimes life offers timid answers, an unexpected phone call, a new smile, a weekend plan that would previously have been impossible. These revelations, discreet but real, began to form a pattern. When someone decides to act with courage and vulnerability, the environment responds. Transformation is contagious. Others feel empowered to change too, because they see it as possible and that the risk is worth the gain. This account shows that the test of faith here took the form of relational healing. It wasn't a spectacular display of power, but a labor of patience and determination. The hidden truth that guided Clara didn't come with a comprehensive manual. It came with practical steps that required discipline, forgiveness, and persistence. And what seemed like a sacrifice turned out to be an investment with a human return, restored affection, rebuilt trust, a sense of home that pulsed again. The story still harbors unresolved tensions, memories that occasionally return, and the awareness that the journey is not linear. But the behind the scenes of this transformation shows that there are methods for navigating pain. Silence to listen, words of reconciliation, concrete actions that speak louder than speeches, and a renewed mindset that prioritizes the common good. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, and as we go along, you'll notice similar patterns appearing in other accounts, small decisions that become milestones, courage that translates into everyday gestures, and an impact that extends beyond the immediate family. Comment below that resonates with me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. The story I'm about to tell has the bittersweet flavor of the things that mark us for life: loss and gain, fear and relief, shame and pride. I call this part the real cost of faith because, often, when someone decides to follow an inner voice, hidden truth that calls for change, the price is immediate and concrete. I'm not talking about abstractions. I'm talking about possessions that are lost, status that erodes, looks that change, and the sense of ridicule that arises when a choice goes against social expectations. But I also speak of the spiritual fruit that springs from these losses, that profound impact that redirects the journey and transforms mindsets. His name was Marcos, a man of solid routine and respect in the community. His life revolved around work, responsibilities, and a semblance of control. The house was tidy, the bills were paid, his friendships were balanced. No one could have imagined that an inner calling would take over his mind and heart, demanding decisions that seemed, at first glance, reckless. The voice he heard didn't arrive as a spectacular revelation. It was a subtle insistence, a discomfort that arose in the silence of the car. In the middle of traffic, a recurring question: what truly has value? This question began to erode certainties and lay bare priorities. The first practical consequence came in something seemingly small. Marcos began donating part of his salary regularly, with discipline. To others, this would seem like an act of generosity. To him, it meant losing the comfort of a secure accumulation. His family was surprised. "Who are you donating to?" they asked disapprovingly. A sense of ridicule set in when coworkers found out and made jokes on social media about this charitable chapter that would be shrill-lived. The external pressure was immediate. Comments, stares, the feeling that he had become a target of scrutiny. Losing social status hurts. Losing monetary certainty hurts too. And with each test of generosity, a small part of what seemed unshakable was lost. Then came something more acidic, a promotion proposal that required overtime, travel, and exposure. It was the opportunity that, in the past, would have been the pinnacle of recognition. The decision required a clear choice, following the voice. That urged more prayer time, family presence, and simplicity meant forgoing the promotion. Accepting the promotion would mean reinforcing a mindset where success and external validation define value. Marcos, silently, decided to refuse. The repercussions were immediate. Surprised colleagues, a disappointed boss. Within his inner circle, cutting questions. "Don't you want to grow? Are you sure?" The cost of his decision wasn't just financial, it was a shift in identity. He went from being someone who climbed the career ladder to someone who prioritized a different set of values. With his resignation came loneliness. At some dinners, old friends avoided him. At gatherings, the topic no longer included his choices. He felt ashamed when family members commented that this isn't a manly thing or that he was losing his practical sense. The cultural mindset, predicated on productivity and material success, spoke loudly. The emotional impact was real. Sleepless nights, doubt, a feeling of having regressed. These moments of isolation were part of the hardest behind-the-scenes faith. At that stage, seemed a fragile ray of protection against the strong wind of social conventions. Many would have retreated. Many returned to their old ways to re-establish lost comfort. Marcos had to decide between the immediate reaction going back to please and fidelity to an inner revelation that seemed increasingly clear to him, and it was precisely there, at the point of greatest loss, that unexpected signs emerged. First, a quiet peace began to inhabit his mornings. It wasn't a thunderous euphoria. It was a tranquility that persisted even when the bills tightened. Then, small doors opened. A neighbor asked for help and found practical support in Marcos. A friend reciprocated with a presence on difficult days. A distant brother reconnected. The generosity he chose had produced echoes that returned amplified. The gain didn't come in grades or promotions. It came in reconnected relationships, in a reconstructed purpose, in a sense of usefulness that didn't depend on external recognition. There were also inner revelations that changed Marcos's mindset. He realized that what he called loss was, in many ways, liberation. Freeing up time from professional ambitions created space to listen more clearly. Freedom from expectations reoriented decisions toward what sustains the soul. The transformation happened in the details. Less rushing in the morning, more presence at mealtimes, long conversations with his children about values, silence at night that allowed for listening. The practical impact translated into small renewals: patience to deal with conflict, the courage to forgive, the presence to learn to see others without rushing. Of course, the story isn't about an immediate happy ending. The bank account was still real. The pressures were too. There were days of hardship and the need to creatively adjust habits. Marcos learned to cook more at home, to save money, to reorganize expenses, and to accept help when needed without shame. This practical adaptation is part of the behind the scenes of every journey of sacrifice. Radical decisions without planning can collapse. Radical decisions with prudence become opportunities for growth. The humility to learn, to ask for advice, and to accept adjustments was crucial. The test of faith, in this sense, involves not only the courage to lose, but the wisdom to rebuild. Over the months, the perception of spiritual gains solidified. Friends who had previously disdained him began to recognize genuine changes, and some even approached him to understand what had happened. For Marcos, the greatest gain was intimate and lasting, a sense of coherence between belief and action, an alignment between what he professed and what he lived. This coherence brought peace, sustained by daily practices that didn't depend on applause: prayer, moderate fasting, meeting with the community, and helping those in need. The transformation wasn't spectacular in the eyes of the world, but it was profound enough to reshape his identity and priorities. The story of loss and gain shows us that the cost of faith isn't always romantic. It's concrete, painful, and requires patience to reap the rewards. And, at the same time, it reveals that the rewards can be more valuable than what's lost because they offer meaning, depth, and a new mindset that withstands the wear and tear of time. Understanding this balance between sacrifice and investment is one of the great lessons these stories offer for those seeking to live a practical and transformative faith. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. And, as we move forward, we'll examine how these elements of loss and gain recur in patterns that can serve as a guide for those who feel a calling but fear the cost. Comment: I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. And, by looking closely at the stories we've already experienced, Dana who gave up comfort, Clara who mended a family, Marcos who accepted losses to gain. Coherence, a common thread emerges that weaves these stories together. There are subtle patterns, almost invisible at first, that repeat themselves behind the scenes in these journeys of faith. I don't say this as someone who piles up theories. I say it as someone who has observed various narratives and perceived a practical logic that helps transform intuition into actions with concrete impact. Several stories show that, behind the apparent drama, there is a routine of small decisions that shape a new mindset. And understanding these patterns is useful for those facing their own unease. The first pattern is the inner silence before the answer. In almost every story, there is a phase of noise that precedes clarity, the noise of obligations, external voices, habits that mask what the heart is trying to say. And then comes a silence, not an empty silence, but a space where the uncomfortable sensation becomes a word and a direction. This moment is crucial because it is where the hidden truth begins to emerge as an invitation, not an imposition. In these moments, transformation takes shape. This is why simple practices of silence, turning off the phone, spending 10 minutes in prayer, walking without thinking about problems appear repeatedly as tools of discernment. This is not distant mysticism. It is a practical method. When the mind slows down, old patterns lose strength, and a new vision reveals itself. The promise here is not immediate comfort, but clarity. And this clarity is the basis for coherent decisions. The second recurring pattern is that of continual testing. Initial obedience is rarely enough to seal a change. After the first act of courage, challenges arise that seem designed to measure the firmness of the decision. Criticism from those who don't understand. Temptations that reappear in seductive forms. Circumstances that pressure a return to the familiar. These tests are not punishments. They function as furnaces that purify intentions. The journey requires constant small acts that are repeated, and that, over time, shape character and priorities. In practical terms, this translates into discipline, maintaining a prayer practice even in days of doubt, persevering in forgiveness even when hurt returns, continuing with acts of renunciation when the advantages of the old path are offered again. It is repetition that builds spiritual muscle. And, interestingly, the initial resistance of friends and family often ends up being the benchmark that highlights the authenticity of the transformation. The third pattern, and perhaps the most rewarding, is the emergence of unexpected fruits. When someone responds to their inner voice with concrete steps, the return is rarely limited to public trials or visible trophies. Instead, discreet and lasting fruits appear. Restored relationships, clarity of purpose, a new peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances, opportunities to serve that previously went unnoticed. These fruits are valuable because they operate at profound levels. They restore meaning, align life and belief, and reshape priorities in ways that extend beyond the individual, touching family and community. And the most surprising thing is that many of these gains only become clear over time. They are fruits that ripen silently, like those that grow hidden from view and only appear when a cycle is complete. These three patterns, inner silence, continual testing, and unexpected fruits, form a kind of path that helps us understand why the 7 unrevealed messages of Medjugorje mobilize such radical decisions. It's not a magic formula, but a map of discernment. The hidden truth is first revealed within, tested in daily life, and, if faithful, manifests itself in impacts that transform mindsets and produce enviable character results. The word transformation fits here not as jargon, but as a description of a process. Changing habits, reconfiguring priorities, making decisions that reorient the entire journey. In the realm of practical decisions, these patterns suggest applicable steps. First, create intentional spaces for listening, simple rituals that drown out excess noise. Second, accept that change will be tested and prepare to resist with consistency, not impulse. Third, look patiently at the fruits, recognizing that the impact is not always immediate but often more lasting. The mindset that forms from this journey doesn't prioritize appearances. It prioritizes coherence between belief and practice. This has concrete implications: professional choices that respect prayer time, relationships that receive renewed attention, and consumption habits readjusted to create space for the essential. At the same time, it's important to be honest that not every calling has the same meaning for everyone. The mechanisms are similar, but the context of each life, family, economic conditions, responsibilities requires prudent discernment. Courage without consideration can lead to hasty decisions. Waiting without action can turn clarity into fear. Therefore, the most helpful accounts are those that show not only the final result, but also the behind the scenes, the conversations with a spiritual guide, the small tests applied, the practical adaptations that allow for sustained change without collapse. There is wisdom in learning from those who have already walked the path, just as there is value in consulting community and conscience. Several stories we heard also highlight the importance of humility, recognizing limits, seeking advice, and being patient with one's own pace. True transformation is rarely spectacular. It is slow, sometimes painful, but cumulative. The hidden truth that guides these paths requires decisions, yes, but also a learning attitude. The consequences, when mature, show an impact that cannot be achieved in isolated scenes. It is a new fabric formed by many small, coherent, and repeated acts. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, and we'll observe how these patterns emerge specifically in different contexts, whether living alone, with a family, or in community leadership. As you continue, you'll see how small variations in practice generate unique effects and how to apply these clues to your own journey, without predefined formulas, but with guidelines that serve as beacons in moments of choice. Comment: this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Discerning whether an inner voice is a true calling or just a passing desire requires more than sensitivity. It requires a method of heart and reason that allows us to transform intuition into prudent and coherent decisions. It's not a matter of creating a rigid formula. It's learning to read signs that recur in the journeys of those who have been through this, perceiving the revelations behind the scenes of life, and applying this understanding with humility. When we speak of practical discernment, we are talking about a combination of inner peace, coherence with deep values, fruits of love that manifests in daily life, and the confirmation that comes from prayer and community. These elements, integrated, offer a compass that helps avoid mistakes and cultivate a true transformation in mindset and life. First, peace. Don't confuse peace with the absence of difficulty. The peace I speak of often arises in the midst of unease, like a firm silence that persists even when circumstances remain difficult. Several reports show that, after a decision was taken seriously, despite the initial pain, a peace finally arrived that didn't depend on external approval. This peace is an indicator that the decision is aligned with something deeper than a momentary impulse. It doesn't act like an anesthetic that eliminates all discomfort, but like a light that allows one to walk without panic, even on uncertain terrain. When inner guidance brings with it this tranquility, even if accompanied by trials, it is a significant sign of legitimacy. Next, coherence with the gospel, or, if you prefer, with a set of spiritual values that guide life. This isn't an empty opinion, it's a practical way to check whether the calling leads to actions that promote love, justice, and humility. Ask yourself, does the message I sense lead me to actions that benefit others or merely inflame my ego? Does it lead to charity, forgiveness, and the search for truth? Or does it create division and pride? Discerning involves testing the coherence between what one feels and the teachings that underpin faith. In many stories of transformation, the inner voice that proved true led people to act with more charity, to make decisions that brought families and communities closer together, not isolated them. Coherence, in this sense, is a filter that protects against manipulation and illusions that can masquerade as spirituality. The third sign is the fruits of love. It involves observing concrete and lasting effects. Peace in relationships, multiplying gestures of service, re-establish trust, presence in the little things. Fruits that manifest not only in intense emotions, but in repeated and tangible actions. True transformation usually generates practical changes. Time dedicated to those in need. Forgiveness that becomes practical. Small sacrifices that make room for the essential. These fruits don't necessarily appear quickly. They usually mature over time, like a harvest that only becomes apparent after months of cultivation. Still, if you begin to notice that your choices bring more compassion, more availability, and a life oriented toward service, this is strong evidence that the calling is authentic. Finally, confirmation through prayer and community. Isolated discernment is dangerous. The human mind is susceptible to bias and confusion. Therefore, many spiritual guides and traditions recommend seeking confirmation through dialogue, whether through prolonged prayer, fasting, or conversation with someone you trust who has a mature spiritual experience. Community acts as a mirror, offering perspectives that a person, immersed in their own journey, may not see clearly. Testimonies we have repeatedly encountered indicate that decisions validated by wise counsel and solid spiritual practices tend to weather storms better. This does not mean relinquishing personal freedom, but integrating it with prudence and humility, allowing the hidden truth to also be verified in coexistence and collective experience. These signs do not operate separately. They work together, as parts of a single discernment mechanism. The peace that accompanies a decision becomes more reliable when the transformation bears fruits of love. And these fruits gain weight when there is coherence with deep values and when the community confirms the path. Several accounts reveal this synchronicity. First, the silence that allows listening, then a decision accompanied by peace, followed by tests that strengthen conviction, and finally, fruits that validate the journey. Understanding this pattern is recognizing that faith is not improvisation, but a sequence of steps that, well guided, lead to real impact on life and relationships. In practice, how can we apply this in our daily lives without losing our sensitivity? Start by creating routines that encourage silence to listen more clearly. Maintain prayer and reflection practices that support our decisions. Seek out trusted people with experience and balance to share doubts with and listen to advice. Carefully observe the fruits, not just fleeting feelings, but concrete changes in the way we relate and act. Allow our mindset to shift gradually. Small, repeated decisions tend to be more sustainable than impulsive, radical acts. At the same time, don't confuse slowness with inertia. Discernment also requires courage to act when peace and confirmation appear. It's important to be honest that this path requires balance. Courage without prudence can lead to exaggeration. Prudence without courage can become cowardice. The transformation these stories point to requires a combination of boldness and wisdom, of surrender and calculation, a mindset that embraces revelations but also tests, that accepts risks but learns to rebuild wisely. Behind the scenes of this journey, there is discipline, conversation, tears, and small victories. There is also the lucidity of those who recognize their limits and seek support to avoid getting lost in baseless radical movements. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, and, as we move forward, we'll analyze cases where community confirmation was decisive, and where the lack thereof led to deviations. We'll also look at how to apply these discernment clues in your specific context, without prepackaged formulas, but with guidelines that serve as beacons for life-changing decisions. Comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. There are stories that pull us to a more prudent place, precisely because they show that spiritual experience can be as fragile as it is sublime when discernment is lacking. I want to tell the story of a person who lost their way not out of malice, but out of confusion, and how community and prayer acted as instruments of correction. It's a story to learn from without romanticizing, to understand that true transformation requires courage, yes, but also humility, method, and a support network. Spiritual life has a backstory very similar to everyday life, and it is in these backstories that hasty decisions can have a real impact on someone's trajectory. Her name was Louisa. She was a committed woman, active in her parish, known for her joy and generosity. It all began with small inner revelations, strong sensations during prayer, recurring dreams, a persistent feeling that she should do more to experience what she felt. At first, the changes were positive. She began to dedicate more time to prayer, tried to help neighbors, and participated in service groups. But over time, what had been a healthy impulse took on more intense forms. Internal messages began to mix with literal interpretations of certain signals, and the line between what was considered authentic and what was an emotional need became blurred. The confusion grew when Louisa encountered people who confirmed what she was experiencing. Some well-intentioned advice, others not so much. Without clear guidance, she began making radical personal decisions. She distanced herself from some family members who, according to her, weren't on the same path. She impulsively donated assets. She agreed to play a central role in a small group that gradually isolated her from other social networks. At the same time, her spiritual language became increasingly absolute. Those who didn't accept her changes were viewed with suspicion. The transformation that could have been a testament to humility began to generate divisions, and the impact was practical. Old friends drifted away. Her professional life suffered, and Louisa began to feel a void that couldn't be filled with rituals or virtual confirmations. The most delicate moment came when a misinterpretation led her to make a decision that jeopardized her emotional and financial well-being. It wasn't as extreme as abandoning essential responsibilities, but it was enough to create a collapse. Unplanned sales of assets, loans taken out to finance an unsustainable initiative, and promises made under emotional pressure. The immediate consequence was a sense of failure and shame. In the medium term, her family was worried, and the community divided between those who blindly supported her and those who perceived the need for intervention. The hidden truth that had seduced her revealed itself incomplete when confronted with the harshness of everyday life. The reaction could have been judgmental or punitive. Instead, something life-saving stepped in: authentic community and the practice of thoughtful prayer. Some close friends, sensing the growing confusion, decided to act with empathy. They sought to talk to Louisa respectfully, not to confront her with accusations, but to rebuild an environment of mutual listening. There were simple encounters: a coffee with a trusted friend, a long conversation with an experienced spiritual leader, moments of unhurried joint prayer to resolve everything. These actions weren't dramatic, but they were firm in what matters, re-establishing boundaries, gently asking if there was clarity, offering support, and, when necessary, advising pauses in decisions involving resources and commitments. Community prayer played a decisive role. Rather than emphasizing feelings, the community helped Louisa establish criteria, pausing important financial decisions, seeking professional counseling to organize debts, and returning to practicing small spiritual disciplines that fostered serenity, such as daily silence and regular confession. This process brought two essential benefits. First, the possibility of re-evaluating choices more clearly. Second, the acceptance that avoids paralyzing shame. When someone makes a mistake, what heals is often not immediate condemnation, but an outstretched hand that helps reorganize life with prudence and practical love. There was resistance. Louisa, at times, felt inhibited, hurt by having her experience questioned. It's human, but over time, she realized that the community wasn't seeking to erase her spiritual experience, but rather to protect her from interpretations that could harm herself and others. This balance between respect for inner experience and the demand for practical responsibility was crucial. Humility began to emerge, admitting that she had overinterpreted signs, asking for forgiveness for hurtful actions, accepting guidance to reorganize her life. These attitudes weren't easy. They required vulnerability and discipline showing. Signs of true repentance is also part of transformation. The behind-the-scenes nature of this correction was pedagogical. Louisa was advised to document her feelings in writing before acting, to seek an experienced spiritual interpreter, to consult people from different backgrounds, a financial advisor, a therapist when necessary, a trusted spiritual guide. This doesn't diminish the mystical dimension of the experience, but it protects her from impulses. The key here was prudence, choosing timing, measuring impacts, integrating community and practice. And the result was gradual. Debts were reorganized, relationships were reconnected, and a spiritual life matured because she learned to live with reason and limits. There are clear lessons in this journey. First, that even the most intense spiritual experiences require a body of verification that includes community and objective practices. Second, that error is not a final sentence with dialogue and prayer. It is possible to reorient the course. Third, that sustainable transformation is built at the intersection of deep desire and concrete responsibility. This story reminds us that hidden truth can reveal itself authentically only when it passes through filters of prudence and love. We are not saying that all distrust is necessary. On the contrary, we want to protect the sensitive terrain where revelations arise, without allowing it to become a terrain of harm. The humility taught by this case is one of the greatest protections for those on a spiritual journey. Learning to say, "I could be wrong," asking for advice, accepting limits, submitting plans to those with experience. All of this is part of the maturity that makes transformation fruitful. The practical impact is evident. More solid decisions, less improvisation, less avoidable harm. The revelations remain personal and profound, but now nestled within a network that helps them flourish without burning the garden. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, and, as we go along, we'll explore how to apply this prudence in everyday life, how to structure a personal self-check process, who to look for, and what signs indicate it's time to pause and reevaluate. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, and I want you to feel, for a moment, the breadth of the stories that became visible proofs of faith, those moments when the journey ceases to be merely internal and becomes a concrete gesture, a service to others, a healing that gives a name to the transformation. Imagine the music slowly rising, a discreet violin that swells, and quick cuts showing moist eyes, hands meeting, doors opening. It is this rhythm that marks the emotional peak of these testimonies. I'm not talking about thunderous miracles, but simple events that, together, create a profound and lasting impact. Revelations that not only change mindsets but reshape entire lives. The first testimony comes from Joe, a man whose routine was guided by efficiency and productivity. It was hard to imagine that his professional life could give way to a more human commitment. But after months of restlessness and a practice of silence, something changed. He began volunteering part of his time to help at a local foster home. At first, it was hours stolen from his rest. Later, it became a priority. The impact was practical, and immediate children who previously lacked a routine began to be fed at decent times. Old toys were repaired. Someone learned to read patiently. Joe's transformation wasn't just a sentimental fact. It was a change in decisions. He reorganized his schedule, reduced work, travel, and redefined his ambitions. The result? Restored human relationships, a sense of purpose that replaced anxiety with productivity, and a service-oriented mindset. Seeing Joe holding a child's hand and smiling, to the sound of a soundtrack that now uplifts rather than consumes, is seeing the proof of faith in action. Next we have the story of Marta, whose inner healing seemed unlikely after years of carrying guilt and resentment that gnawed at her mornings. The voice that called her urged her to seek reconciliation, to face painful memories with courage. Their first encounter was tense to bodies, 2 stories, a table between them. The noise of the city outside served as a backstage soundtrack, and Marta's internal camera recorded every breath. Little by little, words that had been swallowed for years began to be spoken. There was crying, shame, timid pleas for forgiveness. And then, the unexpected. Instead of rejection, there was a welcoming response. Healing came not in a spectacular gesture, but in a sequence of actions, regular visits, phone calls without agenda, a presence that replaced excuses. Marta's transformation translated into lasting peace, less remorse, and a greater capacity for love of fruit, evident when she now cares for others in pain, unafraid to expose herself. The visible impact was both on her face and in the lives of those who came to rely on her support. There's also the story of a small group that came together around a seemingly simple cause, reorganizing a community center struggling to survive. Led by people who felt a calling, including young people who had little and did a lot. That initiative became an example of how faith can produce social impact. People who previously lived isolated began attending workshops, receiving professional guidance, and finding emotional support. The transformation here is collective. Decisions made together, hours of volunteer work, conscious donations, trade classes yielded tangible results, jobs created, relationships reestablished, hope restored. The hidden truth revealed itself in everyday actions, and the greatest testimony was seeing neighborhoods that were once places of fear become spaces of coexistence. This is a kind of proof of faith that spreads, because it doesn't depend solely on an enlightened heart, it depends on a body that acts. On another note, I encountered a case where the test of faith manifested itself in a change of vocation. Someone working to build a prominent career felt called to a simpler life, dedicated to pastoral care and caring for people in distress. The decision involved material sacrifices, mental adjustments, and a financial reorganization that demanded humility and creativity. The result, however, was a capacity for listening that transformed services into true healing journeys. People who had previously felt empty found solace. Young people in conflict received concrete guidance, and families began to communicate again. The impact is not just emotional, it is institutional. Leaders who previously prioritized numbers now prioritize people. And when we speak of transformation like this, we speak of a ripple effect that resonates throughout the community, at school, at work, and in Jesuit gestures that redefine what success means. Visible proof of faith also appears in more intimate actions, such as caring for an elderly person home alone, visiting prisons with reading programs, or leading small collective efforts to rebuild homes after disasters. Each of these actions is a testimony that says, faith doesn't just remain in words, it becomes habit, routine, commitment. Soaring music, before and after cuts, human faces that open up. All of this creates a narrative of hope. And the crucial point is that these fruits don't spring from thin air, they come from repeated decisions, from a daily life that chooses to love even when it's tiring. It's in this thread that we see the coherence between belief and practice, the mindset that isn't content with appearances and seeks real impact. Several stories we hear at pilgrimages and gatherings also demonstrate the depth of revelations. It's not uncommon for priorities and habits to shift over the course of months, and with that, the surrounding environment changes along with them. Transformation is a word that loses its meaning if seen as an instantaneous product. It's a process, like a harvest made from small seeds planted with discipline. Seeing someone who was once afraid to look in the mirror now lift their head, smile without shame, and embrace meaningful days, this is visible proof that inspires others to try. At the same time, it's important to recognize that not every trial comes with grandeur. Often, what inspires is simplicity, an act of forgiveness that breaks a legacy of hatred, a gesture of care that saves someone's dignity, a decision of humility that becomes an example. These unexpected fruits show that impact doesn't depend on the size of the gesture, but on the depth of surrender. And there's something revolutionary about this: transforming mindsets, rewriting priorities, opting for decisions that place others at the center. It's in this daily radicalism that faith is tested and becomes contagious. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, and as we move forward, we'll explore in more detail how these fruits can be recognized, cultivated, and above all, sustained over time, because the true test of faith isn't a single peak, but a life that endures, generating costly and lasting impact. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. After going through stories of renunciation, reconciliation, loss, and gain, and seeing patterns that repeat themselves behind the scenes of faith, it's time to close this section with a summary that doesn't empty the experience, but offers a practical step for you to experience something similar, a concrete, brief, and accessible action that doesn't require spectacle, just presence and decision. Following Mary's voice is a test not always easy, but one that bears fruit. These words summarize the learning we've experienced. The test of faith isn't limited to the enlightened moment. It manifests itself in the constancy of small choices that change mindsets and destiny. And it's precisely this constancy that I want to invite you to experience now, without rushing, without drama, simply with honesty and openness. The practical proposal is twofold, designed for those who want to test their heart and, at the same time, create a field of silence to hear. More clearly, the first suggestion is a 1-minute guided prayer, simple gesture that can be done wherever you are. Take a deep breath. Close your eyes for 30 seconds. Quietly or mentally, say, "Lady, help me to hear clearly. Give me courage to accept what is essential and wisdom to avoid what is vanity. Show me one small step I can take today, and give me peace to accept the consequences." Remain silent for another 20 seconds, listening to what emerges: a name, a feeling, a memory. Write it down quickly, if possible. This minute is a practical test of attention. If something concrete emerges, it's a sign worth investigating. If only uneasiness arises, the invitation is to persist. Repeat the gesture in the coming days, keeping a record in your notebook or on your cell phone. The second suggestion is optional, a short 24-hour digital fast, not as an empty penance, but as an exercise in creating space. Choose a day that's feasible. Avoid social media, reduce notifications, and delimit periods without television or distracting content. Replace part of this time with silence, prayer, a brief reading of a nourishing text, or a concrete act of service to someone close. The purpose of the digital fast is to experience the difference that a less cluttered mind makes in the quality of listening. Many people report that, in these spaces, a new clarity emerges. Ideas that previously seemed confusing begin to take shape. Decisions that seemed impossible come with a peace that allows one to move forward. He reminds us that this is not a magic rule, but a method of discernment. Silence creates conditions. Subsequent choices depend on prudence and accompaniment. In proposing these actions, I'm not calling for reckless radicalism. The intention is to offer practical tools, small decisions that act as tests, and help calibrate one's spiritual sensitivity. Brief notes, for example, are essential. When something arises, be it an impulse to forgive or a reminder of someone to reach out to, write it down. Over time, the notes reveal patterns. What seemed like a momentary emotion can reveal itself to be consistent when it resurfaces. Furthermore, seek out someone you trust to talk to. Community and spiritual confirmation help validate experiences and avoid mistakes that arise from isolation. Prudence doesn't nullify surrender, it protects it, transforming impulse into a sustainable journey. I also want to emphasize the importance of viewing transformation as a process involving daily habits. The mindset that forms when faced with a calling doesn't arise from a single, spectacular gesture, but from the repetition of small acts that, over time, reshape priorities. The discipline of a minute of daily prayer, the conscious choice of small fasts, the repeated gestures of forgiveness, all of this creates a fabric that sooner or later begins to support larger decisions without despair. The test of faith, from this perspective, is less about the intensity of the moment and more about fidelity to the process. Consistent decisions demonstrate character. Character bears fruit. That it's also important to recognize the risks. Don't confuse emotion with confirmation, nor move important resources without advice. If the direction involves significant financial, professional, or relational impacts, seek practical help. A spiritual guide, a mental health professional, financial counseling. Prudence is an act of love for yourself and those around you. Community that welcomes without suffocating and questions without judgment is one of the greatest gifts for those who journey through this process. The transformation we desire to see strengthens connections, not destroys them. When something isolates and impoverishes lives, it's a warning sign. In proposing this practical step, the goal is for you to have something concrete to experience, neither theory nor romanticization, but practice. You allow yourself this test and observe honestly. Was there any sign of peace? Did any confirmation come? Did fruits emerge, even if subtle? If so, investigate calmly. If not, repeat the exercise patiently. The journey of faith has a rhythm, and hidden truth, when respected, usually reveals itself calmly and clearly. He also reminds you that transformation generates visible impact when it translates into service, forgiveness, and presence. It's not about testing others, but about internal coherence that ultimately touches the lives of those around you. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic. And, moving forward, we'll look at practical examples of how to transform these minutes and fasts into a sustainable personal roadmap. How to put together a discernment notebook. Who to seek out in the community for guidance, and what concrete signs to look for in the first 30 days. If anything you've seen so far resonated with you, leave the phrase "I'm with you" until the end in the comments. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Knowing someone is following these stories makes all the difference. If this content brought you clarity, comfort, or sparked a positive awakening, subscribe to the channel. Here we continue to bring you stories, signs, and practical tools to live this faith in your daily life. always with responsibility and care. Leave the phrase "I'm with you" until the end in the comments. If this video touched your heart, I read and respond. And that's how this community grows stronger. If you liked it, leave a like. It's a simple gesture that helps the message reach those in need. There's a video here that complements this topic. Click it and stay with me. There come. See more stories and practices that can transform your journey.